MTP 203, Unit 5, Dyed Backgrounds. After learning variety of textural patterns in this fifth and concluding unit of tie and dye course, we will now learn different methods of developing dyed backgrounds. Objectives. After studying this, you will be gaining knowledge about what are dyed backgrounds, how these dyed backgrounds are created. Introduction. Quite simple tie-dye patterns are generally enhanced when carried out on a long length of cloth, previously dyed with these areas of plain color or texture. These can be placed at random or planned to fit in with the proposed design. In the main background shapes, the textures are obtained by adapting the normal method of tie and dyeing so that larger areas can be patterned more easily and quickly. For the superimposed pattern, really large-scale shapes look well as they form a frame for the background texture. Textured backgrounds. Marbling large pieces of cloth. It is quite possible to dye a length of cloth several yards long with the marbling technique. Method. Circles. Mark out large circles, arrange in a regular repeat or of varying sizes, placed at chosen spots on the cloth. The outline may be tacked, but this is not essential. Bunch up the fabric within each circle into a tight mass and bind it to form a solid knob. If the cloth is placed flat on the table, the bunching up process can be carried out more evenly. Each individual knob can be dyed, giving circular patches of marbling on a white ground. To get an all-over texture, the tacking threads must be drawn up and the cloth in between the knobs bunched up and bound before the whole sample is dyed. Another method of texturing in between the circles is to bring the two salvages together to make a tube lengthwise and to add open binding in between the knobs, which now project on the outside. dye, rinse, dry and untie. Rectangles. Make lines of tacking stitches down the center and each side of the sample. Run another set of lines across so that the cloth is divided into large rectangles. Bunch up the cloth within each rectangle for marbling and bind into a knob. Pull up the tacking threads, dry, rinse and dry. Each knob can be dyed separately before drawing up the tacking threads. Pull up the tacking threads, add more binding. Then immerse the whole sample in different colored dye. Squeeze, rinse and untie. The rectangles may all be dyed in different colors or two colors as in a draught board, or the cloth dyed so that the two halves are of different colors. Section. In some cases, a sample may need dyeing in sections, probably in several colors. Mark out the cloth as desired and run tacking stitches along the dividing lines. Place the cloth flat on a table or on the floor and proceed to bunch up the fabric within each division into a solid mass. Bind each mass separately until it is formed into a solid knob. Pull up the tacking stitches. And fasten off. each knob separately into a particular color. Rinse and dry. Add more binding. If the whole sample is to be immersed in another colored dye. Tube. When all over marbling texture is preferred, the following methods will give very satisfactory results. This is an easy and effective way, and one which will allow a great deal of latitude, producing spare or dense pattern according to the amount of binding added or the length of time left in the dye bath. Method. Place the cloth flat on a table or on the floor and have at hand a reel of cotton beginning at right. Pick up points across the cloth at intervals and collect them together in the left hand. Wrap the cotton round this bundle to hold it in place while the next group of points is collected. Wrap the cotton round this next bunch, pulling it just right enough to keep the cloth in a loose roll. Continue in this way, working along the cloth, forming it into a sausage, keeping the right side on the outside along the tube. After the first process, the sausage of material will be approximately 1/3 of its original length. Using stronger thread or fine string, rebind the loosely bunched tube firmly from one end to the other and then back again to the beginning with open crisscross binding. Repeat this backwards and forward binding until a very tight sausage, still further reduced in size, is produced. Dye, rinse and dry. More binding may be added and the sample dyed a second color, or the whole sample can be untied and rearranged so that the blank areas are brought to the fore and the well-textured parts buried in the center of the tube. Bind as before and dye in the same or a different color. Rinse, dry and untie. A two-color effect may be obtained with only one binding by the following means. Form the fabric into a tube as described and bind very firmly. Immerse the sample in the dye bath and leave until the dye has penetrated well into the bundle. Squeeze and rinse, but do not dry or untie. Dye again in a very strong or concentrated color, immersing the sample for a much shorter period. Rinse after the second dyeing. Dry and untie. This same scheme will work in reverse, making the first dyeing a very short dip and the second a much longer period. Rinsing or not in between according to the effect desired. These experiments give a more watery, subtle texture. If this is considered inadequate, a much darker dye can be painted on the outer edges of the tube, or the cloth bunched up and bound again and dyed a third color. After a little practice with this kind of texturing, it is possible to get a marked difference in the effect of varying the tension and thickness of the binding. Fine thread, coarse string, or rope can be tried, all of which can be previously dyed. Self-check questions. This is the first of your self-check questions. Please try to answer these questions, and then towards the end of the lesson, I am going to give you the answers of these self-check questions. Question number 1. Mention those methods through which marbling are done with larger pieces of cloth. Question number 2. How all-over marbling texture is obtained? If you have answered these questions, let us continue. Twisting and coiling. This technique is readily adapted to patterning long lengths of cloth, where 2, 3 or 4 yards of material are involved. It is advisable to enlist the help of another person to hold the second end of the cloth and to twist it in the opposite direction. When it begins to curl back on itself, fold it over in half, as it is more difficult to bind the central portion of a long coil of cloth. The sample may be folded into 3, 4 or more U-bends. This makes it easier to handle and incidentally cuts down the binding necessary. Tie and secure the 2 open ends when binded to give the type of texture required. Binding may be open, crisscross, loosely or closely packed, in lines or bands, using thread or thick string. Dye, rinse and dry. Untie when dyeing is complete. For a more evenly distributed pattern, fold the cloth in half or into 4 lengthwise before twisting and coiling. After dyeing and untying, repeat the whole process, refolding the cloth so that the areas from inside comes to outside and vice versa. Dye in one or more colors, rinse and dry, and then untie. A length of cloth may be gathered up and tied at intervals of 12 or 18 inches. These links can then be folded and collected together in a bundle. Tie the two open ends. Secure one end of the bundle. Twist each loop into a circular coil. Then bind the whole bundle. If this is bulky, leave it longer in the dye bath. Before dyeing a second or third color, untie the binding but leave the bundle tied at one end. Untwist the loops, then retwist them in the opposite direction, turning the outer edges in the inside and bringing the inner undyed areas to the outside. Bind and dye a different color. Rinse, dry, and untie. A length of cloth may be twisted into a coil. Wrapped round a base and bound before dyeing. Knotting a long length of cloth. This is carried out in the same way as the smaller sample, but the cloth may be folded in half lengthwise before being knotted. Repeat the process several times, bringing the parts from the inside of the bundle to the outside in turn. The knots need not necessarily be tied in the same place on the cloth for the second or the third dyeing. After each dyeing, rinse, dry, and untie the knots. Repeat until a satisfactorily all over texture is formed. All over knots on a length of cloth may be employed. These need not be spaced regularly nor repeated in the same place before dyeing the second or third time. Rope tying on a full width of cloth. Fold the cloth down or across into pleats about 2 or 3 inches wide. Make bindings at intervals. This will mean drawing the pleats into a smaller compass or making necks, dye, rinse and dry. Add open binding along the whole sample and dye again. Second, fold into U, bend, add binding and dye again. Third, twist each unbound portion over diagonally. Add binding and dye. Dye the edges of the folds a different color. All the rope and folding techniques can be carried out on a larger scale using the full width of the material when a large piece of cloth is being used. To save time, it is possible to fold it in half across or down. Then proceed to mark out the pleat, the folds as if working on a single cloth. Bind and dye as before. The edge or individual stripe. This is a most useful method of obtaining a variety of background stripes. Fold and dye several stripes together as one. Other stripes can be dyed at right angles to the first layer. Clamp dyeing. Tie medium to large objects in the cloth at random or to form a regular repeat. The multi-spot method of picking up points of cloth on a needle bunching them together and binding as a clamp carried out on a large scale is an ideal way of arriving at an exciting background texture. Objects may be tied in the cloth some distance apart. Dye, rinse and dry. Collect the clamps together, bind the background and dye in a different color. Roaching. Tie the cloth into loops. The thread on a piece of wood. Bind and dye. Sewing. The following are suggestions for speeding up the sewing process to make good backgrounds. Large stitches and rows further apart. Binding may be added to help form a recess. Second, lines of running stitches on double cloth. Make wider tucks and fold 2 or 3 together to sew as one. Third, for an all-over sewn texture, make rows of large tacking stitches 4 to 8 inches apart. Pull up tightly. And add a little open binding in between the rows. Fourth, fold 2 inches to 3 inches tucks over 3 times and over sew with large stitches. Tighten threads before dyeing. Fifth, using large stitches, tack a diamond net arrangement on the cloth. Pull up the threads and add binding if necessary. Sixth, fold the cloth over double widthways. Place pins at intervals from 3 to 6 inches below the fold. Oversew the fold, taking the stitches down to the line of pins. Remove pins. When pulling off this giant size oversewing, bunch up the cloth unevenly underneath the stitches. Fasten off. Repeat these tucks over the whole cloth. They can be placed in between narrow bands of oversewing or rows of tacking stitches. Dye as required. Rule lines 4 inches to 8 inches apart, down or across the material. Oversew the space in between the lines. The lines may be dyed as edge stripes or tacking stitches made along them on single or double cloth. Pull up all the threads and fasten off. Dye, rinse and dry. Do not untie. Make another row of oversewing over the first in the opposite direction from the previous layer. Pull up the threads and dye a second color. Rinse, dry and untie. Eighth, make sets of 3 or 4 large accordion pleats at intervals across or down the fabric. Pin in place using very large stitches. Oversew each group of pleats as a single. Tuck. Draw up the threads and fasten off. Before the second dyeing, stitches may be made in the opposite direction, back over the first one. A little judicious binding may be added to all these sewing methods if it will save time, help form a better resist or give a more interesting texture. Large-scale sew spirals on single cloth make an attractive background. They may also be sewn in shape of triangles, stars, or rectangles. Binding. The material can be gathered into a tube lengthwise and covered entirely with open or lattice binding. Add another layer of binding, which may be applied in certain areas in wide or narrow bands before dyeing a second color. A much darker dye can be brushed over the outer folds. Rinse, dry, and untie. Repeat if necessary. It is possible to make the material into a tube widthways for the second tying up. Bind and dye. Rinse, dry, and untie. Large pieces are best tied in 2 stages. Fold the cloth in half, dye the sample with one half to the outside, then untie and repeat the process, bringing the second half to the fore. This will ensure that the texture is more regularly distributed. Vary the material for binding. Yarn string, raffia, tape, as well as the usual thread. Dyed threads used at intervals or over the whole sample help to give an interesting quality. Areas of color. Draw the outlines of any shapes required and sew round them with large tacking stitches. Pull up the threads and fasten off. Add binding where necessary, usually along the drawn up lines of the sewing. Dye each shape and rinse individually. Immerse the whole sample in the dye. Rinse, dry, and untie. A symmetrical. When resist shapes are needed on a dyed ground, cover each shape with close binding after drawing up the sewing thread. A symmetrical shape may be halved, drawn and sewn on double cloth. Use the folded stripe method for bands of color, either across or down the sample. Dip the edges of the folds in dye or bind. Where required, and dye the whole sample, and more binding and dye the second color. Rinse, dry, and untie. For circles picked up a point of cloth and bind according to the size desired. The pleated oval or diamond method on a large scale is very useful for backgrounds. Use a dyed shape or a resist shape on a dyed background. Activity. Prepare a dyed background for a wall panel with the measurement of 15 inches by 20 inches with any of the above techniques. Summing up, all the creative techniques explained in this course of tie and dye have given us the complete information about numerous methods of creating textures to the fabric by tying the fabric with various techniques like binding, folding, roaching, treating, pleating, etc. And then dyeing the fabric. In the above 5 units, we discussed many methods of creating tie and dye patterns in details. These techniques provide us the excellent method of creating interesting and unusual backgrounds too. Possible answers to the 2 questions I had asked you. The answer to the first question is, following methods are used to marble large pieces of cloth, that is circle and rectangle. Section, tube, or in the second question the answer was the tube method. Thank you.